week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Very, very much appreciated. Also got a nice comment from Paul at Brave New Spirits. Looks like they enjoyed the episode of the show as well. So everything's wonderful, isn't it? So time for this week's episode of the show, and you're probably wondering what the title page is all about. Well, I shall explain. Now, when I do an episode of the show, I like to say nice things about the whiskies I review, and because I often find if I say unpleasant things, people tend to get upset. So I do kind of select the bottlings quite carefully, but the thing is, and I've probably said it on numerous occasions, it does kind of paint a rather sort of incomplete picture of the independent bottling scene. You know where this is going, don't you? Let's put it this way, everything in the garden does not always smell of roses. In fact, it smells of something else in a lot of cases. And now, you know, independent bottlers often say, well, we thoroughly sort of check our casks, and we reject more than we purchase. And yeah, I hear it over and over again. And frankly, I don't really believe that. There are far too many, not necessarily bad whiskies. There are a lot of bad whiskies that are bottled. There are a lot of whiskies bottled that are not particularly interesting. And you know, you think about, you sort of taste these samples, and you think, you know, why was this bottled? And there's so many reasons why. Sometimes it's, you know, they need something to bottle, and it's bottled far too young. Sometimes it's, you know, they've obviously invested money in this cask. They may well have bought it as a fresh fill. It hasn't kind of worked out as they wanted it to, but they need to get the money back on it. And, you know, if they flogged it off to somebody else, they wouldn't get the money, so they bottle it. Sometimes I believe they actually think that some of these whiskies are really, really good. And you're sort of like wondering, ooh, what planet are you on? Or what planet were you on when you tasted it? So, yeah. Basically, the whiskey industry is not full of wonderful whiskies. Not every whiskey that's ever bottled has been absolutely gorgeous. There are an inordinate number of stinkers, shall we say, and I'm going to show you some today. Now, of course, if I told you who bottled these, I would get no end of grief. So I'll tell you what the distillery is. I will tell you the age of the samples. I'm not going to tell you the cask numbers. I'll give you the ABV, but I'm not going to tell you when it was distilled or when it was bottled. So I'm going to kind of like, you know, you might be able to figure some of them out, but I'm not going to sort of give you the opportunity to go, oh, that was bottled by so-and-so. Now, these are all bottled by individual independent bottling companies. Some are pretty well known, some maybe not so well known. And you're probably saying, well, why are you doing this? Because every now and again, you have to basically sort of prod the lion to a certain extent, if that's the correct terminology. The whiskey industry, you know, can't just get away with just bottling crap and expect everybody to go, yeah, that's wonderful. You know, this is why I always insist on tasting samples, because I'm not going to stick something on the shelf talking, but obviously all my comments have no relevance or bearing to the company that employs me. But if I was a whiskey seller, you know, a retailer, you know, I can't put something on the shelf that I don't know what it tastes like, because the, you know, customer buys it and tastes it and go, my God, this is god awful. They're never going to come back again, are they? Now, if you're the sort of company that, you know, just purely sells whiskey and that's all you do, and you're a big chain and etc., you know, you're going to accept the odd one or two of these kind of things happening. But when you're slightly a smaller company, you have to be really careful, because the last thing you want is people to start saying the whiskey they purchased from you was god awful. So anyway, And you know, there is a sort of a side of me that really does enjoy sort of being critical. You know, it's all well and good every now and again sort of being, you know, saying everything is marvellous, everything is wonderful when it really isn't. Sometimes it's just nice to be critical, and today I'm getting that opportunity. So let's have a look at those. So first dram we're going to look at is a Knockdhu, and it is 8 years old, 48.2%, and it was a single Oloroso cask. Do you think that looks like it's been matured in an Oloroso cask? Well, if that has been indeed matured in an Oloroso cask, it hasn't imparted any colour, and so therefore you initially think, ooh, shagged out old Oloroso cask, no character in that whatsoever. So instantaneously your kind of, you know, crap whiskey radar is sort of going deep, you know. That's not always the case, but you know, these kind of things do kind of make you think, Right, so bottling number 2 is a Tomatin. Now it didn't actually carry an age statement, although the spirit is, I believe, around about 5 years old. The reason it didn't carry an age statement is because the independent bottling company decided that they weren't going to put age statements on any of their whiskies that were under 8 or 10 years old, because they thought it might give off the wrong impression. Nobody cares these days about age statements as long as the whiskey is good. Anyway. Number 3 is a 12-year-old Speyside. I think this was a small batch rather than a single cask, and it was bottled at 51%. Bottling number 3 is a Macduff. Oh yes, a Macduff. And it was 7 years old. Bottled at 46%, and it was a single bourbon cask which had been sherry finished. It's got a slight tinge of olive oil to it, is all I can say, which again kind of like sets the crap whiskey radar off and running. The fourth sample of the day is a Caol Ila. My God, one of the most consistent distilleries in Scotland, and and they are not immune to a poor bottling. You have to go some way to cock one up, it has to be said, but well, yeah, we'll come to that one in due course. 14 years old. It was bottled at, well, if I give you the exact ABV, it's probably going to, you'll give the game away. So let's say it was bottled at over 50%. So like I said, 14 years old and aged in a bourbon hoggy. The final dram of this afternoon, if I get there before actually this lot kills me, is a Ledaig. Oh, yes, and this is a pre-2008 Ledaig as well, I can tell you. So it's 11 years old, bottled at 45%, and it's been mature or finished, sorry, in a wine cask. So as you can see from the colour, not a sherry cask, but a wine cask. So anyway, I think this is going to be a whole load of fun, but it's also educational, because I'm going to obviously point out why I think these particular ones should never have been bottled. So anyway, let's start off with the Right, okay, so let's kick off with the Knockdhu then. 8 years old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Okay, now it's not horrible. It's quite chocolatey. It's biscuity. It's young. There's a bit of a rawness there. There's a bit of a raw kind of spirit note. There's a little bit of white fruit, stoned white fruit, subtle barley. It's not dreadful, but it's not the most appealing Knockdhu I've ever come across, and because you don't see very many of these bottlings, certainly in the independent sector, it's always a case of I really hope it's going to be good, and 9 times out of 10 the ones that I've tasted anyway have been really good. This, although is not dreadful, is not sort of setting my pants on fire, it has to be said. Anyway, let's see what the power's like. Ho hum. Vague, cereally, bit biscuity. A little bit of raisinated fruit kind of comes through on the mid palate. It really is pretty disappointing. It's fairly short. There's no real intensity, and it's kind of, now I don't know what this would have had to have retailed for, but you know, it was just seriously not worth it. And it was kind of, like I said, it was not a bad spirit. It's possibly been bottled a touch too early, because there is that sort of youthfulness, and it hasn't got much of a length. It really should have been sat on for a little bit longer, and that's the biggest criticism with that. It's not that it was a bad cask, it was just it was bottled too soon, and there's far too many instances of that happening, certainly these days. Okay, so let's move on to the second bottling. This is the well, young Tomatin. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? It's a bit raw. Again, it's suffering the same kind of issue that the first bottling had, the Knockdhu. It's herbal, it's young, it's, again, apparently an Oloroso cask, first fill Oloroso cask at that. No, don't believe that one at all. Yeah, right, maybe there's an intimation of some sherry, but there's no colour, it's not dark, it looks like an American oak cask to me, or a refill sherry cask possibly. There's a bit of banana skin, a bit of gooseberry, green fruit. Again, it's not a terrible nose. It's just been bottled far too young. It's just not evolved enough. You know, there's virtually no oak character whatsoever, and the spirit is just kind of left there, you know, hanging, if you see what I mean. Anyway, let's see what that's like. It's got a acerbic, bitter green fruit finish. It's not particularly pleasant. And again, I think it's just basically all down to the fact it's been bottled at too young an age. It really needed some more time in the cask, just to kind of, well, get some kind of wood influence. That would have been nice for a start. It might have taken your sort of like taste buds away from the slight acerbic character of the green fruit. And again, it's short. It's sort of again, I don't know what it was retailing for at the time. But again, it was kind of one of those sort of whiskies that I tasted and just went forgettable. Absolutely, completely forgettable, and that's it, isn't it? You know, it's like kind of like, you know, if it's memorable for sort of the right reasons or even the wrong reasons, it's interesting. But when it sits in this kind of morass of kind of uninteresting, uninspiring, frankly dull whiskies, it's kind of you just forget about it, and it is just instantly forgettable. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Speyside. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Ooh, 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 that is a terrible nose. I mean, it's kind of glue and gunflint. Oh, dear God. I think there's some white fruit there. I think there's some sweetness. Frankly, it really is terrible. I mean, it's a terrible spirit. I mean, and if this is a batch bottling, oh, whoever picked up this batch of casks, it was really kind of wishing they'd sold it on to somebody else, because it's got this weird kind of dried herbal note developing now, kind of like, you know, mixed dried herbs. So you've got kind of glue, sulphur, dried herbs. Can I kind of interest you in a bottle, possibly? So, I'm going to put this in my mouth. The things I do for you guys, I mean, that is awful, terrible. I mean, it really is shockingly bad. It's possibly one of the worst whiskies I have come across in my entire life, and I've tasted a lot of whiskey. I mean, it's kind of wet cardboard, glue, sulphur, again as that weird dried herbs kind of thing going on. It's disjointed, it's just frankly all over the place. It is just poor spirit at the end of the day. Obviously the Speyside distillery would probably be up in arms about this, but you know. Right, okay, so let's move on to my favourite distillery, Macduff. Yeah, let's see what the nose gives us on this end. Right, okay, so you cannot say this does not have distillery character. It has it by the bucketful. It's stinky, it's sulphury, it's kind of, if it was a rum, it would be Hampton. It really is funky, but not in a pleasant way. It is as hard as nails. It's classic Macduff. I mean, alright, there have been more sulphury Macduffs, certainly. You know, I can't remember who bottled them, but again, it's kind of lost in the midst of time. You know, there have been some really awful Macduffs. I mean, it's not terrible. Well, it is terrible actually. It's kind of not. It's terrible because it's not my kind of cup of tea. It's hard work. It's kind of industrial. It's kind of hard as nails. It's kind of, well, why do I really want to drink this? You know. But like I said, if you want to experience the full Macduff experience, this would have done the job. Anyway, let's see what the power's saying. That kind of grabs you. It's not as bad as the Speyside. There is maybe a little bit of honeyed sweetness there, but certainly not enough to offset all that slightly sulphurous, industrial, hard barley, hard spices. It has this kind of amazing ability to be slightly watery, but also slightly alcoholic and masked on the finish, even at 46%. I mean, that is a really impressive thing to carry off, it has to be said. It's a bit grubby, it's a bit, you know, it's kind of Macduff at not quite its worst, but Macduff at its kind of almost worst, if you see what I mean. I have, you know, come across more enjoyable bottlings of Macduff. They do exist, but, you know, more often than not, I'm afraid this is the style of the spirit that's produced at Macduff. And what do you do with it? Shove it in a sherry cask, obliterate it with sherry, or first fill American oak. Lots of sort of, you know, but make sure it doesn't come across as too sort of burnt caramelly. You know, just do something with it. You know, don't. I mean, I know at the end of the day I go on about being a purist and love to taste distillery character and you know, age it in bourbon, ex-bourbon, all that kind of stuff. You know, there are some times when you really do need to shove it in something else, and that was one of those times. Right, okay, Caol Ila. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Oh, what's going on here? I feel like Jeremy Clarkson, like, ooh, you know, cheese, and we're kind of like blue cheese and Parmesan cheese. I mean, literally. I mean, it's a unique Caol Ila, it has to be said. it's a bit raw, it's herbal, there's a little bit of peat, there's some seaweed. I'm ignoring the cheese, which is really quite difficult. A little bit of black pepper, some green pepper, some gooseberry. I mean, it's got complexity. I mean, you know, you can't argue it's got complexity. There are lots of different things going on. But my God, that cheesiness is just kind of weird. I mean, it is just odd. I mean, it's not, you know, I mean, if you like self-flagellation, then, you know, this is probably your kind of cup of tea. But, you know, considering the amount of Caol Ila that I've tasted and, you know, how much of it has been, you know, absolutely spot on the money, this is just kind of like a, you know, what was it, the fly in your Chardonnay, or that kind of thing, to quote Alanis Morissette. Anyway, let's do the pass on. Less weird, it has to be said. Not quite so cheesy. Quite stringent. Green pepper, green bell pepper, oily tarry peat, a little bit of bog myrtle. Quite masked in actual fact. Well, not quite. I mean, it is masked a bit. I'm going to put a little drop of water in to see what that does to it. So, in essence, the palate has kind of almost redeemed itself. It's still got a little bit of a weird edge to it, but, you know, that nose. Oh, good God, that nose. You know, I've put some water with it and it's gone kind of really kind of soapy and confected, and there's a slight cardboardiness. I mean, it's kind of, oh, I mean, it really has kind of fallen apart, absolutely. Which is just, you just would have never expected this to happen to Caol Ila. But it goes to show you, doesn't it? Sometimes casks do this kind of thing, and there's absolutely no rhyme or reason for it. It's an almost sweet solventy kind of note as well. And palate. Sugar water. Dreadful. Just knew from that nose, you just knew that the palate was going to be pretty grim. There's no character there, there's no peat, there's nothing apart from sugar water. I mean, it's just, ugh, you know, God, bloody hell. Right, okay, let's finish on some old school leche then, shall we? And old school leche that's been wine cask finished. Whoa, what horror show have I got in the store here? Oh dear God, Sulphur City. I mean, you know, it's got that kind of herbal nettle-y. I mean, it's literally, you smell a nettle leaf. Next time you come across a nettle, smell a nettle leaf. It is just like smelling a nettle leaf. All right, there's some slightly syrup-coated red fruit. There's some peat. There's some manure. But the sulphur is off the scale. I mean, it is kind of, I mean, I don't even know if it's all spirit sulphur or cask sulphur, a combination of the two. Who knows? I mean, it is bloody awful. I mean, yeah, some of the old 80s booners were kind of some of the most sulphured whiskies you're ever going to come across. But I'll tell you what, this is actually putting it in a run for its money, it has to be said. Let's see what the pal's like. Murky, earthy, sulphured, astringent, bitter. Really, that's the thing, when you often find these kind of heavily sulphured whiskies, and I'm sure that a lot of the sulphur is probably cask related, the palate is just really bitter and green and hard. Yeah, there's some peat. I don't really get a great deal of fruit, red fruits, you know, winey fruits, anything like that. It's all about the murk at the end of the day. And you know, this was bottled in a prestige range by this particular independent bottling company, and I really kind of wonder who the hell actually tasted this cask and thought, yep, let's put it in the prestige range, because no, not at all. I mean, bloody awful, really bad. I mean, you know, we all knew that sort of, like I said, old school leche can be pretty hard work in its own right, but then you stick it in a ropey old wine cask and you're just sort of like, wow, unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. Great finish. I mean, great finish to the episode, I should say.
Waves are calling me back as you're driving.
Okay, so let's start today's episode of the show. Now, yeah, being serious now, I mean, yes, this is a whole lot of fun. Everybody enjoys being critical and poking the line and all that kind of stuff. And but the reality is that what I was trying to sort of bring across is the fact that not everything is marvellous in the whisky industry. There are casks and batches that are bottled that really do not come up to the plate. They do not come up to the mark. And sometimes I think that the whisky industry as a whole, not just the independent sector, really needs to kind of think about what they're bottling and why they're bottling. Now, you know, the vast majority of the time, you know, there are some lovely whiskies, there's some really good whiskies out there, but every now and again you just think, well, whoever's doing the cask selection must have had a brain fart, because you know, there are some really, not only are there some really poor quality casks bottled, there are also some things bottled that are just far too young, and you think, well, they're only being bottled because the independent bottler needs to bottle something, and they need to keep the price down and all this kind of stuff, and you know, it's just kind of, you really should have sat on it for a few more years. And that is exactly my comments with regards to the Knockdhu. It wasn't a bad whiskey, it was just bottled far too young. And it didn't have enough oak interaction. I mean, you know, allegedly Oloroso cask, I don't believe that for a minute. I mean, the refill Oloroso possibly, certainly, but well and truly reused Oloroso, it has to be said. And you know, you kind of like go down the road of thinking, well, Knockdhu don't actually sell very many casks to the independents. Have they just hived off something that was not particularly good quality? The answer, of course, to this was, if you wanted to bottle it sooner, was do something with an octave or a quarter or something like that, or just sit on it for a few more years. Well, what's the problem? The Tomatin, exactly the same comments in reality, okay? Not a bad spirit per se, a bit astringent, a bit hard. Sometimes I find that with Tomatin, certainly aged in American oak, which is weird, isn't it? Because I love, you know, my spirits being aged in American oak, but sometimes some distilleries like Tomatin just kind of almost benefit from a little bit of sherry. I mean, although in saying that, you know, again, this was allegedly first fill sherry, but I don't believe that for a second. I mean, refill again, possibly. But the worst crime was it was just bottled far too young. And yeah, the Speyside, well, you know, that wasn't bottled too young at all. It was just bloody awful. I mean, it really was god-awful spirit. It really was something that should never have ever seen the light of day. It should have been buried under a truckload of sherry. A truckload of caramel as well would have probably helped it. Really, I mean, you know, I know who bottled it, and I don't know where the head was at with that one at all. The Macduff. Now, I mean, okay, am I being disingenuous? I mean, it had lots of distillery character, and all right, Macduff has got a character that I'm not a particular fan of, but this kind of bottling certainly had maybe an overt distillery character, but it was pretty sulphury, pretty rough, and at the end of the day, it wasn't particularly pleasant. And if I'd have been offered this sample to, you know, asked, would you bottle this, my initial reaction and my only reaction would have been, God no. And And I think that probably says it all, really. Maybe it's a good job I don't work for an independent bottling company, because, like I said, on more than one occasion, I would probably reject Dram site more than I would actually ever bottle. The Caol Ila, like I said, you really have to do something to screw up a Caol Ila. Now, I don't blame the independent bottling company. Well, I do blame them, actually, because they really should have tasted this, because it was a horror show of a Caol Ila. The palate maybe not quite as cheesy as the nose, but it was not a good Caol Ila, and I would imagine that was a fair few pennies on the shelf. 14-year-old Caol Ila. Like I said, sometimes you wonder why these casks, these bottlings are so expensive when it's just Caol Ila. It's ubiquitous. They make loads of it. But the thing is, that's it. The majority of it is really good, classic Caol Ila, but every now and again you get that kind of, it's the weird old cousin with the twitch, and really that should never have seen the light of day. And finally the Leche. Well, you know, it was kind of, you know, what's the word, dicing with the devil or whatever, you know, playing with fire. I mean, it was kind of pre-2008 to start off with, and then yes, shove it in a Salford wine cask. I mean, and you're bottling a prestige range. I mean, why? What planet were you on? I mean, dear God, you know. All right, on the other side of the coin, it was very much Leche, as you would expect, old school Leche. But oh, what a horror show! What a complete and utter nightmare. You know, whoever said that was a great thing to bottle should have been strung up by his toe, in my personal opinion, because that was just such a bad whiskey. Anyway, there you have it. That's this week's episode of the show. I probably won't be doing another of these episodes for quite some time. I mean, yeah, because like I said, you know, I much prefer to sort of say nice things about whiskey, but as we know, that doesn't always happen. So, all that's left to say is I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the show. Keep your comments nice. If you've maybe worked for one of these independent bottling companies and have figured out this is your whiskey, then yeah, okay. But please just anyway. Good dramming, good afternoon.